Hello everyone, Net Narrator here. And what's this? I'm showing my face, I don't do that. Oh yes, I think something's wrong with him.
Oh yes indeed, I think this lad's been working too hard. Somebody call a doctor.
But no, this is an unusual video because I wanted to put the video up to sort of deliver on a little bit of news, and as well to give you a little teaser for something I've been working on. But first and foremost, something else that's been happening on the channel is thank you very much to all my subscribers, old and new, and we've certainly been getting a lot of new subscribers recently, so I'm very, very thankful that you're discovering my channel, and hopefully you enjoy the content. I hope you stick around, and I hope you have a fun time here, so thank you very much for that. We do have something planned for 100,000 subscribers, if and when I hit that milestone, but I won't be going into that too much on this video. That'll be the focus for later down the line, if indeed we hit that milestone. But I just wanted to say thank you so much, and I hope to keep the content coming. I hope to deliver, and I hope to be worthy of your faith in me to keep this up. But the second point of news is that I've recently been working on an audiobook project for Audible, and now the audiobook is now approved and live, so it's up there. You can buy it, you can listen to it. But hold off until I give you a little bit of detail first. So Helheim, which is the book I've done, is the first book in the Fractured Empire series, and it's written by Zachary Degas and Daniel Jones. And these two authors I worked with before, because on this channel we've also featured another book of theirs called The Blade's Own Truth. We featured the first 15 chapters. And obviously they had the rest, and that was quite a few years ago, so hopefully you remember that. If you don't, it's still on the channel if you want to have a listen, and maybe consider buying the book, because it's a great book, and I had fun narrating that, and I had fun reading it, and I had great fun narrating Helheim as well, because it's a little bit different from what I normally do. I would describe it Helheim really as an epic tale of magic and warfare in sort of a Napoleonic etherpunk-like setting. And I think you enjoy listening to it too, as I plan on releasing a few chapters in this video, so don't go yet. I'm going to release a few chapters, including the prologue, and hopefully you enjoy that and you'll consider listening to the full audiobook. And there are several ways you can do that. I do have several links which I put in the description, and they are for the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, France, and Germany. So they're direct links to the audiobook itself. And if you use that link and you haven't signed up to Audible before, what you can do is you can actually sign up for a free trial, and you can listen to the book for free with that free trial. And obviously what happens after that free trial, that's entirely up to you. But, you know, for the first 30 days, it's all nice and free for you, and you can enjoy the book that way. However, if you also already have Audible and you want to listen to the book on that, I also have some gift codes for the UK and the US specifically. I don't have any others, but I do plan on distributing them gradually over time, just to sort of make it fair on all of you. And I certainly won't be like dropping codes in the comments on this video, because, you know, that's a little bit unfair for people. So instead what I'll be doing is I'll be dropping these codes periodically in my Discord, especially if you're a YouTube member or if you're a Patreon and you want to listen. I'm probably more likely going to give you the code then, but also in live streams, for example, and other things down the line. I'm going to give out a few codes and DM those to people as well, if that's what you want to listen to. And with that, I've pretty much finished this announcement. Stick around, because there'll be a few chapters to listen to. There won't be any more than these ones coming up, because ideally you'd want to go to Audible and listen to the book there. Come on, guys, you can't blame me. But I hope you enjoy the chapters as is. I hope you consider listening to the audiobook, and I hope you consider giving a honest review for it as well. I can't ask for positive reviews. That goes against Amazon's TOS. So please just leave an honest review. That definitely helps us out, and you know, if you use the links and if you use the codes, that helps us out as well. We're all indie here, you know. We're you know, the authors just write for fun. They've released a few things on Amazon as well, and I'll leave you the link to the book to read it directly if that's what you prefer to do instead. That's all cool too. And obviously, I'm no professional, super awesome voice actor like the guys on Critical Role. So, I really just enjoy doing this. It's an absolute honor to be able to make it on Audible. And as I say, I hope you enjoy the content, and I hope you consider listening to the book. But that's it from me. Wait a few seconds, and yeah, enjoy the first 5 chapters, plus a prologue. Fractured Empire, Helheim, by Zachary Dugas and Daniel Jones. Prologue. The Gardener. Swadia. Second Era, Greenleaf, year 1629. Mage Hierarch Alan von Harris touched the second finger of his right hand against his inner left forearm, pressing the finger deep into the grooves of carved flesh, allowing the skin of his finger to touch the pattern under the skin of his arm. He felt the heat rise, and he pointed his left arm towards the Swadian soldiers as they attempted to push past the small rubble wall that his men held, in a rather desperate attempt to break through the line of surrounding Imperial soldiers. There was, of course, no way they could do so. They were vastly outnumbered. Outnumbered a good 20 to 1. Even then, Harris didn't relax. He instead felt more apprehensive. A cornered enemy with no hope of retreat or victory was the most dangerous sort of enemy. If a man had nothing more to lose, that man with nothing left, well, he was liable to do anything. The green flame washed over the advancing men. Once they had been dressed in proud and stately uniforms and armour. The Swadian troops were armed and armoured much like his own men, steel half-plate with open-faced helms, though the design was different from Kurtz's armour, and the cloth was red and gold instead of the stark white of his troops. Now, however, he looked at the men as they burned, screaming, the fat in their bodies igniting and feeding the flames, spewing in a greasy black smoke up towards the sky, their peers behind them backing up in horror at the sight. These men were dirty and ragged, not the consummate soldiers he had been expecting. He sighed and closed his eyes, deciding once and for all he did not like the new machines of war that his empire had made. They could easily carry a full battalion of troops, allowing them to flank enemies with remarkable speed and ease, but it took all the challenge out of the fight, all the art out of the defence. "Line volley!" he called, and men stepped up, forming a stacked rank of soldiers, each with a Kurtz vaultlock to his shoulder. There were 3 staggered rows. In the front, men kneeled. Behind stood another row of men, vaultlocks at the sky, and behind those stood a row of pikemen, there to make sure no bayoneted Swadian force got too close. "Line fire!" he called, and the kneeling men fired their vaultlocks. Black smoke billowed across the battlefield as a good 100 rifles all fired in unison. "Rotate!" he called, and the front men moved back as the second line went forward. Staggered rows like this were the most effective way to wage war he had found up to this point. Well, short of striding in himself, and though he was powerful, he couldn't take on an entire army. He knew his limits. He rubbed the inner part of his left wrist with the right thumb, and a soft wind came up, blowing back the black smoke and revealing the carnage. It was a bloodbath. Inside the killing circle, almost all the fighting men of Swadia were dead. They had managed 1 or 2 vaultlock shots of their own, but surrounded like this, they stood no chance. If Harris had to guess, he was willing to bet that most of the dead he found among his troops were because they had circled the enemy and fired on them. Some of the vaultlock balls were bound to go through the ranks, or miss some Swadians and hit his men on the other side of the circle. That didn't bother him. What did bother him, however, was the knot of men standing in the centre of the carnage, completely untouched, even as thousands of vaultlock balls had passed through this area. Around them was a shimmering field of something. It was hard to explain. You could see it, but also couldn't.
It was like looking at something across from a fire, where the heat distorts the image from the other side. "Ah, Mage Counselor Nara, we have been looking for you," Harris said, stepping forward. As he walked, blood splashed up over the white leather of his boots, splattering them as scattering of scarlet, before slipping off of the wax surface, leaving a few bright solitary beads. She turned and regarded him, her bright green eyes aglow with the light of her magic. She was a middle-aged woman, one that still bore the markings of being exceptionally beautiful in her youth. If you asked Harris, he would be inclined to say she still was beautiful. It was something about the eyes, high cheekbones, royal bearing, and posture, and the grey that was creeping into her hair. All of these things seemed to elevate her beauty, past that of what a younger woman could achieve. She still had a youthful vigour. It was, however, her regality and wisdom that were the driving points of her appearance. She turned, and in one hand she held a pistol, the one-handed vault-lock smoking from the discharge, and the other she held her needles. Swadian mages were not like Kurtz. Indeed, they were not even like the Helheim mages to the east. The way they practiced magic was in many ways unique, though the underlying principles still applied. To use a spell, one needed first to have a reaction by combining reagents with an infusion of mana. 2 or more reagents were mixed, causing this reaction, and the mage then amplified it or channeled it. In his case, and the case of all Kurt's mages, they had the reagents tattooed in their skin. Over the years, the reagents would be used up and would need to be tattooed in again. The process eventually left grooves in your skin, lines where the tattooed area was significantly lower than the rest of the skin. The process lessened the power of the actual spells, but it also meant that a Kurtz mage was never disarmed. Helheim's mages were more powerful, as they directly mixed the reagents, but were ultimately slower as well, as they needed to directly mix the reagents, not simply perform a gesture that could be driven into a young mage recruit. As for Swadia's mages, he looked at the needle stabbed into Nara's arm and felt his derision. Swadia's mages put the reagents in hollow metal needles with compartments, mixed them with oil, and then injected them into the body. It meant that they had directly ingested the reagents. It had a strange effect. Most magic was an external thing, aside from some basic healing parts. At least that was so for most mages, but not so for the Swadian mages. They did no external magic. Instead, all of their magic was internal. It limited what they could do without hurting or killing themselves, but the 5 or 6 spells they could do were rather impressive in their own rights. She stood up straight and held her head high as she stepped out of her protective shield. The second row of soldiers shouldered their vault-locks and aimed at her, but Harris held up a hand to withhold that attack. She wore her Swadian mage armor. They wore full plate armor much like that of Helheim's, though the design differed in several places. While Helheim's breastplate was segmented for ease of movement, Swadia's was solid and significantly more rigid. Over that breastplate, they had several pouches that would hold their needles. Their helm was different too. Instead of an angular visor with a single eye slit, Swadia had multiple vertical lines to provide more protection at the cost of vision. The red hood that normally covered that helm was matched with a monastic scapula that hung from the waist, hemmed in gold. She was without the helm. Either she had lost it at some point, or else she had not had time to retrieve it. The red hood down around her shoulders seemed to frame her lovely face nicely. She strode up to him through the blood and around the corpses of her men, of her countrymen, right up to Harris. The spent vault-lock dropped along the way, a forgotten splash in the crimson puddle that covered the paystones here. In one hand, she held her needles, and in the other, she gripped the hilt of the basket-guarded short sword at her waist. "Nara," he said, holding his arms out to the side, making sure to show her he was not about to make any moves. "Give it up. Your city has fallen, and with it the country. There is no need to fall with it. He smiled at her, the sort of smile he only reserved for those on the other side of a negotiation table. Swadir is not dead, she scoffed. We are blooded but unbroken. She said the words loudly. He almost believed that she believed them, but he could see the truth in her eyes. Those words were not for her. They were not even for him. They were instead for the frightened men behind her. She knew, just as well as he did, that there was no escape. Not this time. And she wanted those men to go down with a sense of pride, with some hope that their sacrifice was noble and for the greater good. It was a lie, but it was a powerful one, and it was one that he was happy to give her leave to have. A small leniency, for one who used to be a friend. And here we are, she sighed. These words were quieter than her previous ones. These words were meant solely for him. Is there no way for you to let my ward pass unmolested? She asked, and he glanced at the young child huddled in the middle of those soldiers. The boy had to only be 5 or 6, his eyes wide as he looked at the company of soldiers that had so bravely fought to protect him. I cannot, he said sadly. If we do not deal with him now, he will only be trouble in the future. He is the heir to the throne, she hissed, her hand tightening on the hilt of the sword, causing the leather wrap to creak. And he is just a boy. Please, Elaine. It hurt to hear her say his name like she used to, all those years in the past, during those better times. There is no throne in Swadir. It is a part of the Kurt's empire now, he said, looking her in the eyes, ignoring the second part of her plea. His hands were tied. There was nothing he could do for the boy. Still, better an honest death than the work camps. Those were true hell on earth. Swadir will never be a part of your empire, she spat at him. It and I will die first, she said softly, as she inserted all 4 of her needles into the crook of her arm. In a burst of inhuman speed, she rushed forward and pulled her sword free of the scabbard at her waist, intending to remove his head with the dangerous length of steel. Harris danced back, leaning slightly as the blade passed mere centimeters from his neck and pressed the middle finger of his right hand against the inner palm of his left hand, pointing them down. The blast tossed both him and Nara back, pushing them in opposite directions. His feet hit the ground, and he almost lost his balance as the bottom of his boots slid along the blood-slicked ground. He had to open his arms wide to keep from falling over. It meant he had no time to react to her charge. She hit him with the weight of a cannonball, launched with a double charge of powder, and as she impacted, they fell to the ground. His head hit the ground, and he felt something crunch as much as heard it. His vision flared first white, then red, and finally black in a matter of a single second. Only instinct saved him. Despite his pain, he moved his head to the side and heard the blade of her sword impact on the stone paver, just right of his ear. Something shattered, crystalline, and clear as sharp lines of pain and fire carved their way across the right side of his face and jawline. With a growl, he clapped his right hand on the elbow of his left and willed the magic to work. Lightning arched from his skin and jumped to the ruined blade of the sword in her hand, running up her arm and causing it to fall limply to her side. It fell out her numbed fingers, and he opened his eyes to stare at her. She had pinned him down, placing her legs on either side of his chest, obviously intending to hold him there and end him in a single stroke. Now, however, she sat rigidly, her muscles spasming uncontrollably, clenching and unclenching. Reaching up, he pushed her off and stood, watching as she spasmed in the pools of blood that slicked the stones. Closing his eyes as a wave of nausea rolled over him, he slid his right thumb over the left and felt the warmth of healing as the calamite embedded in his skin came in contact with the cuprum. When he opened his eyes, he saw that she was struggling to get up from the ground, her muscles still twitching and betraying her, unable to even hold her up. Swadian men attempted to rush forwards in a desperate attempt to give her cover, but as they exited the protective bubble she had placed up, they were cut down by a few rather well-placed vault-lock shots from Harris's officers. The fallen men added their blood to the growing river of wasted life. Her teeth gritted in a rictus grin, Mage Counselor Nara died. Her heart gave out as the electricity coursed through her system. She fell back, seemingly in slow motion, the light of her eyes dying and growing glassy, long before she came to rest. The tailings of her silver-blonde hair soaking in the red dye, her shield dying as she did. A rather undignified death for a rather dignified woman. Sighing, Harris leaned over and picked up the ruined sword. A good third of the blade had shattered, but despite this, he still held it up, inspecting it. "A rather nice piece," he said to himself, flashing it through the air experimentally. "This will go rather nicely in my collection." He nodded to himself. Broken it might be, but it was still his trophy. "Sir?" An officer stepped up to him. He ignored the man, continuing to look over the sword and to think of the past battle. Mage battles were always like this, never taking more than a minute or two, never lasting beyond a single attack or two. Often it was the one that struck first that won the encounter. "Sir?" "What?" Harris snapped. The weight of what he had done and what he would need to do, too much for him to keep his mask of composure at the moment. "Sir, the Swadians have surrendered," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "And?" he asked, raising an eyebrow at the man. "Well, sir, what are your orders, sir?" the officer asked, shrinking back further. Harris paused, considering the question fully before answering. "Get rid of them," he said. "And before you ask, yes, that includes the boy. In 10 years, he would come to resent the Empire and work to undermine it. You pick the weeds early, that way they don't choke out the flowers." Yes, sir." The man saluted, then moved to carry the orders to the standing rows of men. Mage Hierarch Elaine von Harris turned away, as 20 Vault-Locks sparked their reply to his order. Men screamed, cried and cursed him and his descendants, and somewhere in the chaos a boy cried out one last time. "Yes," he said, his eyes closed, a single tear sliding down his cheek, as the thunder of Vault-Locks sounded again and again in his head. "I am a gardener." Chapter 1. Helheim. Second Era. Rain's Grasp. Year 1630. Adrian heard the mounted horsemen before he saw them. He glanced over his shoulder at the well-worn gravel track behind him that was pitted with ruts and washouts, where hundreds or even thousands of wagons had passed before. Grinding away at the small grey stones that lined the road, turning them into dust. It had created depressions in a sea of grey that now held water and mud. It stretched out behind him, and curled up around a rolling rise or what passed for a hill in these wooded plains, before it dipped again out of view as it wound through the leafless trees. The skeletal expanse of naked branches was dotted intermittently with an odd cedar or even a willow that had yet to lose its coverings, even this late in the season, though even their colour seemed muted. The sound of the harness as well as the noise of the men was much too loud, and came too quickly to simply be some farmer driving his crop to the market, even had he brought with him his sons and farmhands. As the troop trotted around the corner and into view, Adrian reached out and grabbed his companion by her arm. However, it was a gentle touch he used. Steering her off the beaten path and into the mud on the side of the road, Issy followed his unspoken directions without comment, and stood behind him and off to the side slightly. He glanced at her, taking in her appearance. Shabby woolen clothing fit for a beggar, ripped and patched in so many places, with different scavenged cloth that the thing had more patchwork than the original material. Her skin was just as patchy as her clothing at the moment. Gone was the creamy white colour it was when cleaned, the mud, dirt and grime on it, as well as years spent outdoors with no shelter had rendered it multiple shades of earthen tones. Her hair, which had been a shade of blonde so light it might have well been silver, was now a ropey mess of dirty greys and brown. She was a young woman, no more than 17 or 18 if he had to guess, and as he steered her clear she gazed at him with those piercing amethyst eyes. She might have passed for just some other street beggar, if not for those eyes. Unique to her people, the one physical thing that marked her as a foreigner in his land. She was a Skreeling. Theirs was the untamed wilderness to the north of Helheim, and like the land, her people were often just as wild. Skreeling were a nomadic people, following the herds of Wysons across the vast plains, often considered savages and uncivilized. A few attempts had been made to claim the land and to civilize his people both by Kurtz and Helheim. All such attempts had ended poorly. The Skreeling might be uncivilized, might be savages, but their fighters knew the lands and their magics. It had been a surprise to have a Skreeling in with a new batch of prisoners and slaves that had shown up at the Cyanid Mines labour camp. Women often didn't get sent to that hellhole. Kurtz had other uses for them. It did happen occasionally, however, with the most problematic women. Kurt's labour camps were rather sordid affairs. There was no real guard presence inside the camps, simply a strong outer perimeter. The slaves were allowed to do as they pleased, so long as the quota was met. If it was not, then the guards would discipline the slaves. The beatings were so bad and were randomly doled out that it created groups of slaves that would enforce rules, making sure the quota was met and work was handed out. It was not fair, not by a long shot, but the slaves of the camp had formed their own micro-society. It was no place for a young woman, certainly not one that didn't even speak Hellion, like the rest of the slaves. Adrian had stepped in to prevent an incident. She had stayed by his side since. He didn't know how she came to be there. There was a sort of unspoken agreement between the two of them, so he had never asked. The rumble beneath his warm boots once again brought him out of his thoughts and back into reality. Adrian watched as they rounded the corner, armed and armoured in the full harness of a military unity. There were some 24 men that trotted around the side of the rise and from behind a stand of trees, riding 2 by 2 along the same worn road that Adrian and Issy were on. The troop looked to be a standard cavalry arrangement, with a man leading in front, his standard-bearer slightly behind and to the right. 11 sets of 2 men, each side by side behind them, and a single man in the rear of the formation. The leading man, a hand by the looks of his harness, which consisted of a set of good quality 3/4 plate armour that covered his chest, arms and upper legs. The sabatons and lower greaves were replaced with thick riding boots, in an attempt to compensate for the munition armour's heavy overlapping plates that were needed to deflect musket fire. His helm was off, the chin strap used to hang it off the horse's saddle horn. The men that followed in his troop wore soldiers' standard issue half-plate, which consisted of a breastplate and helm, with no covering for the thighs or arms. Their helms also consisted of open-faced armlets, unlike the closed-faced helm of their commanding officer. The vault-lock and pistols they held in the crooks of their arms, the barrels pointed to the heavens above, and the bayonets fixed on the ends, along with longswords strapped to the mount saddle in front of them. The colours of Helheim flew above them from the banner-bearer's pole, a field of dark blue divided horizontally by a single stripe of gold. To Adrian's surprise, their commanding officer held up a hand as they came near. The unit regularly came to a halt, some men soaring back on their mounts' reins, while others simply fell out of line. One man even had to wheel his mount back around to get back to where he was supposed to be. the squelch and suck of the hooves trailed off, in a way that would have had Adrian's father bellowing grievous and entertaining insults at such a sorry lot as this. Ah well, no matter. "You there!" He paused and considered what he should address Adrian as. Were you supposed to call a beggar to his face? In the end, he decided to skip addressing him and simply went on with his question. "Is that the road to Erkstead?" he asked, pointing his hand, clad in a soft-looking leather glove unmarred by use, down the road at a split. Adrian paused for a second, glancing at the road. He had once known these roads by heart, but that was when he had been a youth and atop a steed, meaning any mistake he made could be made up in short enough time and with little enough effort. "No, sir," he pointed, his long finger pointing out the proper bend. "The road is this way to Erkstead. Follow the left path to a bridge. The crossing is a half-mile ahead. You will round the bend and should be able to see the city. From there it is a good mile and a half down the road." He answered when he was sure. The hand nodded and fished around in his coin purse, pulling out not a copper, which is what Adrian would have expected, but rather a silver tolton. He flipped the coin over to Adrian, but before he could even move, Iss's hand darted out and snatched the coin as it danced through the air, disappearing back into the shabby folds of her robes before anyone could blink. "Women," he snorted, and almost all of his men smiled or chuckled to themselves. "They are quite adept at taking a man's money, aren't they?" Adrian, for his part, simply smiled. "We thank you for your kindness." He bowed, and Issy awkwardly followed his movements, mimicking his bow. The hand nodded and ordered the men under his command back into order, before marching along the road that Adrian had indicated. Adrian and Issy watched as they quickly disappeared down the road. He was not envious of them. He had once been like them. Green, eager for war. But that had been 5 years ago. He hoped he had sent them down the correct road, not only because it was the direction Issy and he were heading, but also because he didn't think sending 24 well-armed men the wrong way was good for their health. As he watched the men pass by, he felt his good mood deteriorate. The smiling beggar's mask he had donned for them slipped away like it had been greased on the inside. In its place, a foul blackness crept back in place. He had been just like them, so jovial, riding with brothers-in-arms to the war on the Helheim-Kurtz border. He had served his country, done his job, and for it, what had it meant? It had gotten him forgotten. It had gotten him sent to a hellhole. 5 years. 5 years he had survived in that pit. He had done things, many, many things that he was not proud of. One did what one must to survive. He glanced over at Issy. She had been the one bright light in that entire black pit, the only reason he had survived. He had done his absolute best to make sure her life there was as easy as could be in that situation. He had protected her, he had killed for her, and she had done the same for him. The countryside passed by slowly, as they methodically trod along, the skeletal forest slightly giving way as they neared the town. The people here were simple, woodcutters, farmers, and ranchers, but that was not the reason a town had sprung up here. That was more because a lord had at one point in time decided he wanted his summer manor here. Workers had moved out to construct the building and their families came with them. More showed up to provide the workers with food and services, and a small city had just grown up around the estate. The household of this person of noble heritage was more like a keep than a house, sitting atop the highest hill in the vicinity. It was surrounded by 4 high stone walls that crested at a height of 3 men, if you had to guess. The entire outer wall structure ran almost 40 lance lengths on each side, and the stone keep in the centre stood proudly over that, boasting an almost immodest 59 rooms for people of royal personage, with stained glass windows that made the churches of most towns weep at the unfairness of it all. It even had an iron portcullis, though there was no moat. As it was perched atop such a high hill, there was no practical need for it. He felt his eyes start to mist over as it came into view. It sat there, standing proudly over the small town. Home. Adrian blinked the tears away, and without even noticing it, stood up straighter. The limp he walked with less pronounced than even a handful of seconds ago. It's funny, Izzy. Back in the day when I was growing up here, I couldn't wait to get away. He cracked a smile. The jagged knife scar that ran down the left side of his face, from cheekbone to the corner of his mouth, twisted as his face made the now foreign motion. I used to think it's so plain. Ordinary, small, boring. Now, however... He glanced over at Izzy. She was staring at his lips with a look of slight wonder and amazement. It was the first time he had smiled in years. Likely, it was the first time she had ever seen him smile. Now, it just looks perfect. She nodded, a smile playing across her lips. She didn't say anything. In fact, she rarely spoke, and never in any language but her own. He had taught her, of course. She understood exactly what he was saying, unless he started to speak too fast, or if it didn't suit her needs at the time. She was quite skilled in forgetting the language altogether for periods of time that were most opportune for her. He had asked her once why she refused to speak his language. The pained and troubled expression that had come to her face, as she opened and closed her mouth in an attempt to speak words that would not come, had seen to it that he had not asked her again. She would tell him if she wanted to, in her own time. Come on, let's go home. Part of him didn't want to go up to the castle walls looking like a beggar, but there was nothing for it. Even with the silver tolton, there was not enough money for a bath and new clothes for both himself and Izzy. Not to mention that the bathhouse only served men on one day, and women every other day. And so it was off to begging at his own doorstep. So be it. He had suffered worse humiliations in the past, and if he only had to suffer one more to make sure Izzy and he were well and truly safe, then that was a price he would be more than willing to pay. The city itself had not changed in any recognizable way in the years. It was still the small quaint village where he had chased girls around with his friend Hefrey, the guard captain's son. Those were good times. Times when the only worry he had was trying to not get caught by angry fathers and brothers for defiling their daughters and sisters respectively. His father had made it amply clear after that first incident that he was not going to provide Adrian with any protection. Last he had heard, Hefrey had assumed the castle warder position. With any luck, he would still hold that post even all these years later. As they neared the keep gate after passing through the town, an endeavour that had gotten him and Izzy a lot of attention. After all, Erkstead was a small enough city that there were only one or two beggars. Not at all like the proper city that had entire beggar communities, like the ones in the capital. The country of Helheim was located in the resource-rich mountain ranges, and the fertile breadbasket fields and valleys to the west of Kurtz. Helheim was around half the size of Kurtz. The only reason it had not been absorbed into the Kurtz Empire was the fact that there were only two ways into the country that large forces could enter. The first was the Pale Pass, a narrow stretch of land that wound through the mountains, just open enough for cavalry and smaller artillery. With the fortress that was built there, it would be a major uphill battle, as at the widest, Pale Pass was only a half-mile wide. The only other way to land troops was by sea, which fed into a small inlet bay by the capital city of Helheim, which was in a bowl-like depression that was ringed with mountains around the sides. Though small, Helheim's navy was not something to scoff at. That, and there was a loose agreement with the Midorians, who hated the Kurtz Empire. So to even get at the Helheim navy, one would need to first beat back the Midorians to the south. The main gate was open, each side guarded by a man in full guard livery, The padded blue and red infantrymen's coats cleaned and well kept, the iron kettle helms polished and shining in the midday sun. Rested in the crook of their arms were bayoneted vault locks, the oak stocks polished and lacquered. Before the invention of the vault locks, they would have had matchlocks, and would have lit their match cores from the fire sconce beside them. "Halt!" the guard on the right called out, his hand held up to stop them from entering. "There be no begging here, you blackguard! Turn around and go back the way you came. The lord of the manor is away. They won't be receiving visitors, especially the likes of you." Ah, so the lord was away, was he? Adrian smiled. He was glad to be home, and he was sure his father would want to see him, but he was glad to put that off for a while. It would give him and Issy some time to get in better shape. Granted, one could not put on tons of weight in just a few days, but it would be much better if he could at least get a bath, some sleep, and some clothes. He was sure those things, plus some good hot meals, would work wonders on himself and Issy. "Tell me, is Hefrey still the castle warder?" Adrian asked, ignoring the guard and turning towards his fellow. "Aye, that he is." The second guard glanced at the first. "Could you do me a favour and run and fetch him? Tell him an old friend has come knocking, and while you're at it, ask him if old man Gala took all the dogs with him this time." He held out a hand, and Issy deposited the silver tolton into it. He used his good hand to flip the man the coin, the hand that still had all the fingers. "Right away, sir," the guard said, and nodded. It was a simple enough request, and it got the man out of standing around at the gate, even if only for a little while. "Having to bribe a guard to get into my own house," he muttered under his breath, as the guard turned and walked into the courtyard. "Oh, how the mighty have fallen." "You won't be let in." The remaining guard hooked his thumb and pointed back over his shoulder. "That's fine. I just wish to see my friend." Truth be told, he wanted much more than that, but it was a start. The guard just grunted and turned back to watch the road. It didn't take long before the sounds of a man running and keys jangling on a loop were heard. Adrian smiled. The man who rounded the corner was not the one he had remembered. Hefrey had put on some weight around the middle. His hair was cut differently, and the youthful beard he had been so proud of was nowhere to be seen. But it was still Hefrey. "Adrian?" he croaked, looking at the man standing before him, filthy and wearing rags. "I am surprised you can still run," Adrian said with a smile. "I could feel the ground shaking with every step you took, you fat bastard. Last time I saw you moving that fast, it was to get away from old man Gala, after he caught you with his daughter." Hefrey practically barreled into him, wrapping him in a brotherly hug.
"It is good to see you too."
Adrian laughed, blinking back the tears in his eyes. "So damn good." "What happened to you?" Hefrey pulled back and held him at arm's length, scrutinizing him. "Last we heard, you were promoted to commander of a force on the border, and when the treaty with Kurtz was signed, you were ordered to stand down. Your father pressed for your return, threatened to pull the army from the border if they didn't get you back." He looked deep into Adrian's eyes. "We thought you were dead." "It's a long story, one which I am sure father will want to hear. Do you think perhaps my companion and I could first bathe and eat? It has been a long and hard journey." Hefrey glanced at Issy, taking in her appearance, looking past the shabby clothing and dirt that covered her. "Certainly. I will prepare a guest room for her and—" "No need. She won't leave my side, and practically refuses to do so. Just my room, though I am sure she would appreciate it if you set up 2 tubs, so we don't have to go one at a time. I am sure she feels as dirty as I do, and some decent clothes would be appreciated." "At once." Hefrey only paused for a second, before answering, "Come, come." He ushered them both into the courtyard. The courtyard of the keep was impressive. It was a large, manicured lawn, with a gravel path down the centre that led to a circular central area with a moderately sized fountain that was at this time not raining down water, due in part to the cold weather. The architecture of the fountain, however, was impressive. There was a man atop a horse, horn in one hand, bow in the other, his cape flowing in the wind, immortalized by the artisan that had captured the moment in time. The horn was raised to his lips, and at his horse's feet ran a score of hounds. All in all, quite impressive.
5 years? Where have you been this whole time?
If you must know, at Kurt's work camp. His friend froze. Adrian didn't notice for a few steps, but as he turned, he beheld an enraged Hefree.
A work camp?
He growled, his face turning red in anger. Peace, friend. I will tell it all later, but first I need a bath. It took some convincing, and Hefree still looked angry, but he led them around the courtyard and towards the manor. Along the gravel path of the walkway, there was a multitude of bushes that were trimmed into immaculate, if somewhat unnatural rectangles, dotted periodically by iron lamps that cast light much more readily than flames of torches. At the far end of the causeway was a manor. It had 5 different chimneys, and its long rectangle front was dotted with glass windows, and hundreds of panes each encased by wooden braces, painted milk white. The entrance hall of the structure was created off the front of the 3-story structure, making the building have an L-shaped look from above. Shoots of ivy crept up the stone facade of the building, gripping the masonry with its viney fingers, defying the will of gravity as it climbed skyward. With a familiarity that only would have been present in a person who had lived here long, Adrian walked with him around the cul-de-sac-like area around the fountain, and towards the foyer of the mansion and walked into the building, pushing the heavy oak door out of the way and entering. The entrance of the manor was lavishly decorated, and rather meticulously cleaned and cared for. However, as this was his father's house, he expected nothing less. Like everything in his life, Adrianus ran his manor house with the same efficiency and attention to detail as a military troop. They were left in his old chambers. It was just as he remembered it, if perhaps a touch dusty, in areas that could not be seen from the door, and before long 2 brass tubs were brought up and set in front of the fireplace, which was just as quickly lit and stoked, May scurrying to and fro to bring hot water up. After shooing Hefree out, he turned to the bath and the now roaring fire. Izzy had already started stripping. There was no hesitation in her movement. The grubby clothes fell off of her gaunt figure, and as the rose fell away it revealed her skin. He could make out each ridge of her spine, and her ribs were painfully apparent. The thing that caught his eye the most, however, was the thing that had always caught his eye. The mess of ropey scars ran from her shoulder blades down to her waist. He didn't find them ugly. He had the right to judge. With an effort, he shrugged out of his clothes and sunk into the warm, blissful water with a sigh of contentment. His own back was scarred likewise. Izzy dipped a toe in the water, pulling it back with a hiss before she once again put her leg in gingerly. Slowly she sunk into the tub, the water coming up to her mid-sternum. The water turned a shade darker as the filth peeled off of her skin. Adrian glanced down at his tub and chuckled. The water was already a murky greyish brown, and he had yet to even start scrubbing. He had a feeling this was going to be the first of many baths today. The poor Mays will be working very hard today. Chapter 2. About an hour and 3 baths later, Adrian was scrubbed clean, his skin raw and red from scraping the accumulated filth. He was currently in cotton trews and nothing else, as he worked on helping Izzy get more presentable. She had also been scraped clean, her skin showing a slightly darker red hue from the abrasive soaps as well, and her hair the pristine shimmer of platinum once again, shining as it lay in damp, clean lines down her back. He brought the scissors up and carefully cut her long hair straight across her back at the hips. It was not the first time she had had him cut her hair, but it was the first time he had done so with nice scissors that didn't rip and pull. She stood there naked, looking at herself in the tall glass mirror, her fingers playing over her protruding ribs. She looked starved, but then so did he. His ribs stuck out just as far. Slowly, she reached up and pulled her newly washed and trimmed hair over her shoulder. Her fingers deftly started parting the hair into 7 different strands, before she began weaving it in an elegant braid as she lay over the shoulder. Once done, she tied it off with a scrap of silk ribbon that had been brought with the dress that had been laid out for her. Turning, she took the scissors and stood up on the tips of her toes, reaching up to snip his hair. Adrian caught her by the wrists and stopped her, opting instead to seat himself on the floor and allow her easy access to his head. For the next few minutes, he closed his eyes while she cut, and she hummed a soft song he didn't recognize under her breath. When she had finished with his hair, she leaned down and began trimming his beard. He was surprised she didn't simply cut the damn thing off. He had thought about doing it himself multiple times, but she simply trimmed it up. Lightly brushing a bit of hair off the bridge of his nose, she stepped aside and let him look at himself in the mirror. He barely recognized himself. In that polished glass, he looked nothing like what he used to. Gone was the young man of 17 years who had marched out to war, fresh and as green as a sapling during Greenleaf. The man sitting in front of the mirror was hardened. The dark brown hair on his head cut evenly, if simply had a touch of premature grey in it. Not much, just a few strands. The beard on his chin was short, about 1 inch long, and the chin area a lighter colour of brown, almost blonde. One scar ran down from just under his right eye, down almost to the jaw, the gouge roughly sewn by the very hands that cut his hair, and now rested on his back as she surveyed her handiwork. Where the scar went into the beard, no hair would grow, giving him a particularly savage look. The biggest change, however, was his eyes. Before, his green eyes would sparkle with joy and life. Now, however, inside was something dark, vengeful, jaded. As he looked into his own eyes, he wondered what that Kurt's guard had seen before he had died. Adrian could still hear the man's gargle screams as water entered his mouth, entered his lungs. He could still feel the burn in his arms as he held him down until the fight had left him. He felt a squeeze on his shoulder and blinked. Glancing up, he saw Issy staring at him through the reflection of the glass. He locked eyes with her, her amethyst one staring deep inside his very soul, nodding as he got up and turned to face her. His hand came up, the pointer curled under and the thumb pressed flat lightly against her chin. He lifted her face, angled it up to his own, and leaned down and kissed her, pressing his bruised, chapped lips against hers. It was a soft thing, a thank you in action when he felt he could not express it in words. She smiled against his lips and pulled away, over to the clothing they had laid out for her. It was simple and comfortable clothing, as they would not be going out to meet any guests. Food had been brought up for them, and the two of them fell on it almost ravenously, devouring it in next to no time. It was the first good meal Aidan had eaten in almost 6 years, 5 in the work camp, and another 7 months that he held the fortress of Maramar on the Kurt's Helheim border, before he had been ordered to surrender the keep to the enemy after a treaty was made. It almost did him in. Breathing deeply, he closed his eyes. Nostrils flared as he fought back the sting of tears, refusing through sheer effort of will alone he would not break down and weep. Not here. He felt deep inside of himself, snatching at the anger that had kept him alive these past years, and embraced it. It didn't take long before the immediate threat of weeping was over, replaced with a slow-burning rage that calmed his frayed nerves, and helped him think straight. The only reason he had not gotten to eat a good meal in the past 6 years was because someone had betrayed him. Someone had purposefully left his name off of the list of people to be ransomed. There was no way it could have been a mistake. All of his subordinates were ransomed back, and the coin matched the contract, meaning that his name had never been put on there. He would find the person that had done this to him, and there would be a reckoning, and reparations of the most violent sort. This he had sworn years ago, and this he planned to do. Issy yawned, her small hand covering her mouth, and he suddenly felt very tired himself. With a smile, he led Issy over to the bed and helped her in, before sliding in next to her. She turned and snuggled up against his side, her head resting on his chest, and was out in seconds. Adrian smiled sleepily, looking down at her. It felt like someone had attached lead weights to his eyelids, and he struggled for the briefest of moments before giving up and closing his eyes. He placed a kiss on her forehead and was out in seconds, following her into the dream world, and completely forgetting he was supposed to tell his friend what had happened these past 5 years. Then High Hand Hadris had that unfortunate reversal. We held the key for almost 7 months against the Kurtz Empire's forces. Adrian chuckled darkly, his eyes distant as he saw the past and not the room or occupants around him. I swear there was not a single rat left uncooked by the time the Emperor had treated with them. Hifri's wife looked sick at the thought of eating rodents. She didn't know, couldn't have known. For the past 5 years of his life, a rat would have been a king's bounty. We were ordered to lay down our arms and locks and surrender the keep over to the enemy commander. He smiled slightly. The smile never reached his eyes as both his hands curled into fists. He felt strange, sitting there. Warm, safe, with a belly full of food and wearing something more than rags again after so long. He pushed the feeling aside and kept telling his story. For my consultation, I had been informed that our fortress had cost the Kurtz Empire an extra 450,000 coins in the treaty tent, plus what we cost him in the field those 7 months. I remember hearing about that. The kingdom was in an uproar about handing over the land, and for such a small amount of money. Hifri spat the words out as though they tasted of bile, and Adrian blinked out of his fog and smiled at his friend. Indeed, it was a poor recompense for the lives we spent. Adrian nodded, glancing over at Issy. She was currently plucking at the frills of her dress in discomfort, obviously annoyed at being so restricted in her clothing that she couldn't even really sit down properly without his aid, what with a large bustle on it. Though she hadn't complained when the corset had gone on, as even on its tightest setting it barely squeezed her. She was too damn skinny. They would have to fix that. Adrian cleared his throat and began again. There was an error. He paused, chewing the word around in his mouth. A mix-up. When the list of men to be ransomed arrived together with the chest of gold, my name had been left off it somehow. The Kurtz quartermaster swore there was no mistake, because the amounts counted out evenly with the names. Adrian's face had gone dark. Though my officers were rescued, I was put in with the unransomed men, and we were all marched to Koltar to be sold to the highest bidder, or shipped to work camps. Surely you protested? Hifri's wife, a woman named Freya, had pulled in a gasp of horror. Ha! A short, humourless laugh forced its way out of Adrian's thoughts. Of course, I protested all the way to Koltar. I protested up till they threw me in the work camp as a slave to work the silent mines for them. Issy stopped messing with her dress and glanced over at him, giving him a reassuring look. Once in the camps, one learns not to protest. It's much better to simply keep your head down and try not to piss anyone off. Adrian possessed. Though you can't look too weak or everyone will prey on you. He tried to shake off the memories of those poor bastards who couldn't protect themselves. I worked their minds for a long time. 5 years, 7 months, and 3 weeks he had counted it out later. At the time, he could not have told one day from the next. Issy was thrown in at some point, I think perhaps 2 or 3 years into my imprisonment. They just threw a woman into a work camp full of slaves. What did they think would happen? Were the guards making sure she was properly protected? Hifri's wife sounded beyond scandalized. No, he responded, and at the confused look on Freya's face, he explained. You have to understand how a Kurt's labor camp works, Adrian said, running his hand through his hair. There are no guards inside the camp, just on the perimeters. The guards only show up to drop off food supplies and new slaves. When the quota was not met, and you really didn't want to be around for the latter of those, and honestly it was probably best to stay away from the 2 former ones as well. Gets pretty nasty most of the time. He looked at her. So, to answer your question, no. No one was going to help her or protect her, except for a daft fool like me. A real smile touched his lips at that, and both Hifri and his wife smiled back. Hifri looking a little proud of his childhood friend. And then we had the best kind of luck. Self-made. A fight broke out. A lot of people died, and when the guards rushed in to prevent the slaves from killing one another, Issy and I slipped out. Only ran into 2 guards. One had been drowned in the river by Adrian. The other... He glanced over at Issy, wondering if it was just a trick of the light that seemed to make those amethyst eyes glow right then or there, or if she was doing something, just like she had done to that man. There hadn't even been enough of him to bury, or identify as human. We walked from the port city of Haltra all the way here, 4 weeks, doing our best to avoid any and all Kurt's patrols, which proved easy enough, as no one would stop a couple of beggars. Or if they did, it was only for sport, and we would not have been much sport at all. 4 weeks! Hifri breathed out in horror. Indeed, and I shall say it is damn good to be home. He sighed as he leaned back in his chair. Hifri, have you sent word to my father yet of my return?
No, not yet.
I thought it would be best left to you. Thank you. Adrian breathed a sigh of relief. For now, I just want to spend the majority of my time eating and sleeping. I don't think I can handle complex matters at the moment.
Well, this is your home. I can't think of a better place to recuperate. We shall leave you for now. Rest. And please do not hesitate to ask for anything at all.
Chapter 3. The past week or so had done miracles to both himself and Issy. For her part, she had filled out well, everywhere. She had curves in places he hadn't seen in almost 2 years. The mines had a way of doing that to people, stripping them of all life. The carriage jostled as the ironclad wheels bounced over a brick paver that had worked his way loose, and now sat above the level of the rest of its kin. The motion brought Adrian out of his thoughts, and back to the dark and gloomy surroundings of the city of Helheim. For his father and most other men in the Consul, Helheim was the rightful heir to the old Empire's lands and territories. His father would stop at nothing to make sure the Empire regained what he considered was rightfully theirs. Holotopa, Nashoba, Issy said with a small smile. He glanced at her and smiled in return. She had just called him Darling Wolf. It had been a term of endearment she had used on several occasions when she had first seen him. She had thought of him as an old wolf, snarling at his enemies. She hadn't told him until later that her Skreeling's tribe spirit was a wolf, and that the wolf was supposed to protect them. He looked at her. She smiled and leaned forward, squeezing his leg with her hand in a comforting way. She had seen Adrian in many different situations. She could tell just by a glance that he was nervous. As she squeezed his leg, she looked out the window, watching the crowds of people with amazement. She had been just as amazed at the sight of the train that had chugged past there on its tracks, that had paralleled the road. Just like then, Adrian enjoyed seeing the curiosity and wonder in her eyes. This all was something he had grown up seeing, but to hear everything in this land had an alien air to it. She had obviously never seen this many people in one place, as the two of them had worked hard to stay away from any city that had a large population on their flight from Kurtz, as a large population usually meant a large number of patrolling guards. He followed her gaze and looked out to see the tall buildings. Most made of wood, plastered over and whitewashed, stood 2 or sometimes 3 stories tall. The packed streets had hundreds if not thousands of people milling about. He was nervous. Nervous to see his father. He had gone to war, held an enemy army off during a siege, killed a man by drowning him, and many other ways, though none as personal or terrible as that had been. To top it off, he had worked in a hellhole for 5 years, and this man still caused him this much unease? His father was a force of nature, a man who would not simply let something as small as a missing son, or rather a son that he had thought was dead for the past 5 years, slow him down. Adrian had often wondered if his father even had emotions. The carriage rumbled on, passing by the buildings and smaller single-family structures, and into an even more crowded section of the city, this one populated almost entirely with shopfronts. On the corner streets, children yelled out news and waved around papers. Adrian had always hated those papers. You could never get the truth out of them. They were practically owned by the Helheim magistrate. All the news that was in it was washed, rinsed, and censored. Not quite to the level of propaganda, but not far off. He glanced down at his hand, the left one, the unwhole one. Gone were the first 2 fingers on that hand, the first nearly lopped off by the knuckle, the other one at the first joint. This was done not only to inflict pain when they were taken from him, but to also serve the purpose of harming his casting. Helheim mages were some of the strongest in the world. Their use of undiluted reagents meant that while they were slower to cast, each cast was more effective. Unlike other mages, a Helheim mage would either lick their fingers or carry a small jar of pure water, then put them into the corresponding reagent powders, allowing the fine substance to coat those fingers. When 2 reagents came into contact with each other, nothing happened. They were just inert powders, unless one was to channel through them. One could not create something from nothing. To cast a light healing spell required calamine and cuprum. A flame required nitra and sulfur. And every spell required something. He glanced down at the small box that was belted around his waist. It looked rather like the ammunition pouch that Helheim soldiers wore into battle. Only instead of paper cartridges, containing a lead ball on top of a load of gunpowder, this box held several smaller boxes. Each of them had a leather lid of their own, and each contained a reagent. A Helheim mage was expected to not only know which box held which reagent in their sleep, but also find them without thinking. To do this, they were drilled until they could access the right combinations of reagents at a moment's notice, no matter what was happening around them. The muscle memory was still there. He would have to fight it now, relearning the movements since his first 2 fingers were now useless, until he got them retrained at least. He glanced over at Issy, once again wondering how she did her magic. She had tried to tell him a few times, attempted to explain it to him. In those moments, he wondered if he was the ignorant savage. Her language had words in it to describe magic and how magic worked that his did not. Concepts they had no names for. "Isthan Butarin?" Issy asked. and pointed out the window of the carriage. Adrian followed her gesture and saw that they had gotten to the sunken district. Helheim used to be part of a much larger empire. Until the Tindracian Empire fell apart, it was simply the largest of the port cities. After Gwal Tor, which was the capital of the old empire, was abandoned, and the land divided between three factions, us, the Kurtz Empire and Swadia, Helheim became the capital of our section of what remained. He shook his head, realizing he had gotten off topic quite quickly. Anyway, what you were seeing in the bay, those are the ruins of a part of the city before the fracturing, as people now refer to it. The random jagged spires that stuck out of the water were the tops of some of the taller buildings, interspersed with a tower here or there that was missing its roof. But the real danger was the fully sunken buildings, most of which stood a hand or two's breadth above the water of the bay. Those buildings made the approach to the city from the old bay difficult, and only passable by small rowboats. The old empire was a force to be reckoned with, and when it came to magic, a juggernaut that wanted more and more power and knowledge, the college was built here in the city of Helheim for the express purpose of studying magic. However, their thirst for higher power was a sip they could not swallow. He sighed, looking over at Issy, a smile playing across his face as he watched her stare in utter fascination at the section of the city that had been under the waters for the better part of a century now. "Your trousers, Hasmen?" she asked, finally tearing her gaze away from the ancient destruction. "No one knows how or why," he answered with a shrug. "All we know is that over the course of a single day, the city of Gwal Tor was abandoned, and if you believe the myths, accursed and haunted, and in that same day an entire section of Helheim was swallowed up whole by the sea." She looked at him with interest, and he wondered which part of that sentence had caught her attention. But instead of asking her, he continued on with his explanation of how the city of Helheim had become the Empire of Helheim. There was a short period of time where the three factions that would become Swadia, Helheim and Kurtz were relatively peaceful, as they consolidated their own territory, but that didn't last. "Dis now Totoranish Mutras." "Yeah," Adrian nodded in agreement. "You're right. People are never satisfied with what they have. Anyway, in those wars, Helheim was one of the great powers. Before the fracturing, we had the college, which gave a good deal more men and women versed in the knowledge of magics. Our reign of battlefield supremacy, however, was not to last. It was the death of Emperor Kaidas that ended it. His son believed that magic was the death of the old empire, and in such thoughts banned the use of magic in Helheim. Emperor Kautif was harsh and cruel. He valued strength over anything, leading the empire down a path of great economic decline. The little economic influxes we did see were spent instantly on mass witch hunts to find and kill practitioners of magic everywhere in the country. "It was Santobaran," Issy scoffed. "Yeah, he was stupid," Adrian agreed with a chuckle. His reign of terror had ended shortly after he had come to the throne, when an unknown assassin ended his life at the young age of 32. His only son, at the age of 12, succeeded the throne. Emperor Julian was far more docile than his father, calling off the mage hunts and re-allowing the use of magic in Helheim. But, to his dismay, it was too late. Most mages who had any knowledge of previous magics had their heads lined on pikes near the throne room. The only form of magic left was the practical war magic, used by the last few mages. A sad mockery of the power the old empire used to hold. Adrian shook his head, and for the 1000th time wondered what secrets those drowned ruins had contained. Emperor Julian had spent the last 50 years of his reign attempting to undo his father's mistakes, bringing mages back to their previous royal status. The hurdle that mages are still trying to overcome is that the empire had spent the previous generation working without magic, so many innovations have been created to do the work mages had once monopolized. Steam-powered machines did the work of 20 men, drilling tunnels and clearing lands faster and with less cost than hiring a mage. Great factories have been made employing hundreds of thousands of common laborers. Steam stacks have been created that were then used to power weaving rooms and in oil refining to make kerosene. And of course the boilers for the trains. Adrian shrugged. The world was the way it was, and there was nothing he could do about it. Nor would he want to change it back to the old ways. It had moved on, and perhaps that was for the better, putting some power in the hands of the common man. And Volok's, of course, he said, thinking of the rather effective weapons. Gone were the days where the mage reigned supreme on the battlefield, dealing death from afar. Now, a basic infantryman with a standard-issue Volok could kill with just as far a range after only a few months of training, instead of the years of intensive and expensive training a mage required. And though a musket lacked the utility of a good mage, it made up for it with its sheer ease of use and easy production. Emperor Julian's son, an emperor the population had taken to calling Emperor Winless the Idle, was a fop of a man, indulging only in every pleasure without a care for the people, choosing to instead hand the vast majority of his power over to the generals and the consul of nobles. A consul whose only real contribution that Adrian could identify was the slight improvements to the city streets that the carriage was rocking back and forth on currently. That and the infrastructure that had made the railways possible. Adrian had only ridden on trains a few times, but every time he had, the trip had been enjoyable. He grimaced as one of the carriage's wheels strayed into a particularly deep groove or pothole and jostled him uncomfortably. Perhaps they should have put a little more money into the roads. As they watched the city change around them, the wood and brick buildings gave way to the more elaborate stone block buildings, and cathedrals at the centre. Most scholars agree that the city of Helheim was built with the assistance of the allied Julsan people approximately 1,000 years ago. Historians' analysis of the building materials age confirm that the city had expanded like circles on the water from the fortress Arkim, which is still the home of the emperor. Those parts of the inner city wall that remained were as ancient as the fortress itself, while the aqueduct and the outer city wall seem to have been constructed a few hundred years later, using the same architectural style. The city was divided into several vicars or districts, each being governed by a consul. Almost as famous as the fortress was the Clarus Magica, the Magic Academy, though attendance was less for mages and more for the general nobility these days, and Pharos Maximus, the Great Lighthouse. The harbour of Helheim faced the inner sea to the north, and was the most important trading site of the empire regarding trade with other continents. Helheim was only a shadow of its former self, but it was still a proud and stately shadow. Though like a shadow, it was nothing compared to its true former glory. Adrian looked out the window again as they pulled around the corner, and the Arksheim came into view. And that is our destination. A massive structure built of stone and metal was more a keep or stronghold than an actual palace, though he didn't doubt it would be rather palatially decorated on the inside. The emperor was known for his opulence. The towering spires and ramparts would be patrolled and manned at all times, even while the emperor was not in residence. Arksheim had so many lanterns and the new electric lights it could be seen all the way from the entrance of the city, even on the cloudiest of nights, so long as you had a straight line of sight. However, even if you did have some structure between you and it, one would still be able to see the glow. Adrian gazed out at the gardens, where the hedge mazes began, and imagined he had seen a shape flitting back and forth in the lawn, only to realize it was simply a sculpture. Adrian sat back and took a deep breath. He could hear his heart beating, thumping. Simply nervous or something worse. He didn't know. He felt his stomach tightening. Upon the stairway leading into the keep stood a 5-man guard, each in immaculately polished chest armor and the blue of the yeoman, elite soldiers that were the emperor's own bodyguard. Each man carried a voltlock, a brace of pistols, and a melee weapon of some sort, strapped somewhere about their body. The carriage driver opened the door, and Adrian stepped out, striding down the collapsible iron footboards that the coach driver had lowered for him, the light wind tugging at the lower section of the long coat that Adrian wore so that it fluttered ever so slightly. He nodded to the yeoman captain, who made himself known by taking a step forward to receive him, and then looked back, offering his hand to help Issy down from the carriage. She didn't need a hand to get down, but it was only proper for a man to help a woman out of a carriage. Adrian had told her this, and many other etiquette rules during the past week, and though squealing, she had grasped onto the matters of propriety and image quite easily. She took his hand gracefully and walked down the iron steps in a womanly demeanour. When she alighted to the ground, she stepped to the side right behind him, in the place polite society says she should stand. "Sir!" Adrian turned back to see the commander of the yeomen saluting him by pressing his hand flat against his chest, all 5 fingers spread over his heart. Adrian glanced at the pin on the man's chest and saluted him back, his mangled hand spread across his chest over his heart. Doctrine could not be unobserved, simply because he was no longer whole. "Commander," he nodded, dropping the salute. The yeoman also relaxed and nodded back. The yeoman captain had looked at his hand, not to see the missing digits, but rather to see the identifying mark tattooed there, that told all that saw it that he was a mage indeed. He was wearing a mage mantle, the blue and gold trimmed half cloak on his left shoulder, but the tattoo helped verify him as a mage. "Sir, we were uninformed that there will be any latecomers today," the yeoman said. He was a tall man, standing around 6 feet or so, and well built with a curly red moustache with a touch of grey and blue eyes. He was suspicious, as well as he should be. It was his job to be suspicious of all that arrived uninvited to his charge's dwelling place. Well, he was simply let the man do his job. It was no concern of his. "Is the council in session at the moment?" Adrian asked. The man had no doubt known that Adrian was a mage as soon as he stepped out of the carriage, perhaps even before. While a normal man would have to either see the reagent box or else the mark, most yeomen were trained to sense mages. How they did so was a closely guarded secret, one that Adrian would have paid dearly to learn. Such abilities, however, were not for the likes of him. They were guards to the Emperor. They needed to be able to counter anything and everything, as they should. He adjusted his coat and looked down at himself. He looked presentable enough, much more so than he had a week ago. He had on a dark blue woolen double-breasted frock that went past his knees with a gold stripe on the right shoulder. The high collar of the mantle, standing up to block the wind, was draped over both shoulders, along with a tricorn hat of the same colour. Under the frock, an undyed set of trousers he tucked into riding boots. On his waist, he wore a longsword, one taken from his house's armoury, and across his chest, held on with a bandolier, was a pistol that was almost the length of his forearm. It was Helheim's military uniform, and it hung a little on him due to a lack of weight. But they made him look more presentable by far than anything else he could have worn. Issy had adopted dressing this past week in a more huerga style than local Helheim fashion. She was wearing a cream white shirt that reached mid-forearm, the cuff of which was decorated in a small amount of frill, as was the neck. Over this she wore a dark red-brown leather corset, tied tight around her midsection, as well as a pair of leather pants and riding boots, with a red and black split skirt that covered the majority of the right leg, leaving the left exposed, freeing up movement. Huerga's women preferred functionality over the more elaborate dresses of their Helheim counterparts, and honestly, Adrian thought she looked more attractive in those clothes, when she felt more comfortable than when she had been struggling in the seas of cloth that made up Helheim ladies' fashion. "Yes, sir. The council has called a formal meeting in the West Wing's meeting room, sir." "And is Consular Adrianus von Tori in attendance today?" Adrian asked. He knew full well that his father was there, but the protocol was protocol. "Yes, sir, he is in attendance," the yeoman commander said with a nod. "Then, if it would not be too much of an interruption to their proceedings, could you get a message to him for me, please, Captain?" "Should not be an issue, sir. Might I ask what the message is?" "Tell him..." Adrian thought for a second, before a smile grew on his lips. "Tell him his son has returned, and wishes an audience." The yeoman nodded his understanding. Right away, sir. The yeoman snapped a salute and turned on his heel, disappearing into the gaping maw that was the Arkim Palace's door. Issy turned her critical eye towards Adrian, stepping around to his front, and leaning forward, she pulled the collar of his uniform straight and pulled down on the hem of the mantle, making sure everything was in order. Smiling, he gave her a quick kiss on the forehead, making sure to ignore the looks directed to the two of them by the remaining 4 yeomen. Well then, this should be interesting, Adrian chuckled, and offered Issy his arm. She promptly wrapped her arm around his, and allowed him to lead her inside the palace proper, where they could wait for his father, out of the cold wind. Chapter 4. It didn't take long, only a few minutes before Adrian and Issy could make out the sounds of 2 sets of booted feet, making their way down the hall toward them. Adrian took the short amount of time he had, before his father was upon him, to look around at the palace. He had, of course, been here before, only once or twice. There was not much need for a commander to be called upon by either the Emperor or the royal staff of the complex. His father, however, spent a good deal of time here, conferring with the Council of Nobles and planning strategies with his staff, back when he had been a general himself. Now that he had retired and joined the Council, he had spent more time here than he had in his own home. The walls and floor were scarlet, accented with gold leaf that shone in the light of a single lit electric chandelier. The tiny bulbs cast much more light than a flame could ever wish to. Adrian's sense of unease deepened as the sound of multiple sets of boots echoed on the marble floors in the room beyond. That was not something he had expected. Several options of who was with his father ran through his mind, but he dismissed them all. He would know who it was soon enough. He took a deep breath, feeling the cold air that had been trapped in the room when the door had opened, to allow them passage into the Arkim to fill his lungs. Large, lavishly carved oak doors swung open, gliding on silent hinges, allowing Adrian to not only see the room beyond, in just as opulent taste as the one he was currently in, but also 2 people striding purposefully towards him, one of whom he expected. The other, well, he had been hoping to not see her for quite some time yet. Adriana's Fontori may have been an imposing man, and even in his supposed retirement, he was still at his core a military man. There was something about how he bore himself that set him apart from the nobles of the Consul, who had never served. Even though he was not in his military uniform, he radiated the command authority he had once held. He was just into his 50th year, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard that still retained a hint of brown. It was beaded in a single strand that hung 2 or 3 inches off of his well-defined chin and cheekbones. His skin was darkened by the sun, though he could never hope to reach the level of golden brown skin Adrian had acquired these past few years. There were deep lines at the corners of his mouth, and at the eyes that Adrian didn't remember. And though he didn't wear his soldier's uniform, had he done so, it would have borne a silver general star pinned above the heart with 4 golden service stripes sewn on the right breast. 1 for every 10 years of military service in the Helheim army. He looked odd in civilian clothing, like a man pretending to be something he was not, but somehow he managed to make it work. As he looked at Adrian, there was a moment of incomprehension and confusion, before recognition of who he was hit him. He stumbled, his eyes going wide. In an instant, it was like 10 years of aging had vanished from his face. Adrian thought for a second he even saw a hint of moisture in his father's eyes. Adrian felt the sting in his own eyes. He blinked it away with ruthless efficiency. Adriana stepped forward and grasped Adrian by the upper arm, holding him there at length, his fingers digging in as he squeezed slightly, as though he was making sure Adrian was really there and not going to disappear. Neither man said a word, each just basking in the feeling of the other's presence. It took Adrian several moments before he remembered that another person had entered the room with his father. He glanced over and was only slightly surprised to see who it was. Emilia Vosturi was both like he remembered and completely different. She, like Adrian, was wearing the uniform of a mage, minus the tricorn hat. Her golden brown hair was elegantly braided and coiled up on top of her head. A functional yet attractive way to keep longer hair out of the way while in the heat of battle. In the 5 years since he last saw her, she lost some of her girlhood angular features and grew into the ideal form of a female battle mage. He smiled at her, glad to see her, while also a little disappointed that it wasn't just his father, Issy, and himself. She did have a right to be here, and perhaps it would be for the best to get this over with quickly. From the age of 5, she had been selected to be his bride. Well, to be more accurate, she had been selected to be his father's daughter-in-law. She had shown quite a bit of promise when they had tested her for magical aptitude. It had been quite the rise in stature from street urchin to nobility, and future daughter-in-law of the former general. He glanced at her wrist, and to his relief, he found that on it lay a golden bracelet, studded around with diamonds, and a single sapphire the same colour as her eyes. So, in the past 5 years she had become married, had she? Emma followed his gaze down and gave him a sad smile. "We will discuss it later," she silently mouthed to him from behind his father's back, her hand reaching out to grip him on the shoulder. "It's really good to see you alive, Adrian," she said aloud.
It is good.
His father paused and dragged in a breath, showing more emotion than Adrian had ever seen him express, except when Adrian's mother had passed away.
Good to see you.
He stood there for several seconds, before removing his arms and looking at Adrian up and down, his face showing a whole host of emotions.
It is good to be home,
Adrian answered, taking a step back, allowing Emilia's hand to fall from his shoulder. "Definitely a step up from my previous accommodations," he said with a laugh. Issy, for her part, snorted and rolled those sparkling amethyst eyes of hers. All 3 of them glanced over at her, and Adrian detected the slightest reddening of her cheeks before his father and Emma turned their attention back to him.
And where exactly was that?
His father asked, once again returning to the stern face that Adrian had grown up looking up to, both physically and otherwise. For the first time in his life, he realized he was not shorter than his father, at some point, without his noticing he had surpassed the man in height by a good 3 or 4 inches. He didn't know why, but it shocked him to realize that he was the bigger man now, someone his father would look up to. "A Kurtz work camp, where I spent the past 5 years as a slave." Adrian delivered those last words in the most deadpan voice he could, then watched his father's face grow red with rage as his blood pressure spiked. "Escaped barely a month ago. Didn't make it to Erkstead until this last week. We had to sneak out of Kurtz on foot." His father glanced down at Issy, and away before what he saw registered, and he looked again at her.
"A savage? From the Skrieling tribes to the east?" he asked, and Adrian looked over at her as well.
Her spine was straight and she was holding herself in such a way that even if you didn't see the pride and challenge in her eyes, you would have seen it in her stance. "Her name is Issy, which she tells me means deer-like, and she escaped the work camps with me." Adrian felt a little spike of anger at his father for calling her a savage, only to have it morph into guilt. He had called her a savage before as well, hadn't he?
"Is that so?"
He gave Issy a smile, and a slight bow to which she responded with a proper curtsy.
"I hear that your people have magics that are strange to us here."
"Ish," she said simply, and Adrian had to hide a smile at the rather confused look that flashed across his father's face. It was not often that someone could throw Adrianus von Tori off balance.
"She said yes,"
Adrian said with a slight smile, pulling up the corners of his lips. "And before you ask, he said, interrupting, as his father opened his mouth to speak. Yes, she does know our language, she just chooses not to speak it. And no, I have no idea why that is. And before you ask, yes, I have asked her.
I see, he said,
looking back and forth between Issy and his son.
And have you asked her if she knows of anyone that could perhaps tell us about these strange magics? They could prove quite useful.
If anyone could tell us, it would be her, Adrian said with a shrug, then explained further. She is a Skreeling mage. I've seen her kill men with her magics, and it is just as strange as you were told. The memory flashed behind his eyes, but he focused, choosing not to dwell on the past. Not today. With a steadying breath, he looked back at his father.
Have you asked her?
Adrian tried not to feel a little annoyed that his father had latched onto this subject. He had always been like this, seeking every advantage for Helheim he could find, and seize upon it. I have, Adrian said, nodding to his father.
And?
He asked, turning to his son. And her people have words and concepts to explain their magic and how it works that we have no equivalent words for, Adrian said with a shrug. How do you explain something when the person you are explaining it to has no frame of reference to understand what you are saying?
Really?
He asked, before looking back at Issy again.
Well, it was a pleasure to meet you, he said, giving her another bow. Adrian, I really do have to return to those worthless fops in the council. If I don't, they are likely to pass a bill in my absence that reduces our empire to a nation of beggars. Tell me you are staying, and we can talk again later after this blasted meeting is over.
I will stay, Adrian said with a nod.
Good. It is really good to see you, son,
his father said, squeezing his shoulder once more, before glancing between Amelia and Adrian.
I am sure the two of you have a lot of catching up to do. I will leave you to it, Adrian. I need you to report to me after the console is over. I wish we had more time to talk.
And just like that, he left, heading back to the business he had been attending. Adrian watched him walk out of the room in silence, and continued to stare after him for some time. Adrian? Amelia brushed her hand against his arm, her voice soft and more than a little wary. It's fine, he said, glancing over at her, or more specifically at the band of matrimony on her wrist. I didn't expect you to wait, not for 7 years, not when you thought I was dead. It had been a foregone conclusion, and even if by some strange chance she had not been wed to another man, then he would have had to break off the marriage, as Issy was his lover now. And if he had anything to say about it, his wife, before the week was out. I just wish father wasn't so wrapped up in work. He has a lot on his mind right now. I don't know how informed you are of the past few years. I have been in a slave work camp. I know literally nothing of what is going on politically. She opened her mouth to speak, but he continued. And honestly, I don't care. I am sorry, Adrian. I would have waited had we known. Emma is fine. 2 years apart, then 5 years thinking I was dead, is much too long. Honestly, I am relieved. It would have been much worse had I come home and had to break off the marriage myself. He smiled at her. Break off? She looked confused. Why would you break off? She glanced over at Issy. The savage girl. Her name is Issy, and I would appreciate it if you used it, he said, his previous mood souring slightly. Father is not going to approve of this. She is not a Helheimian and... She breathed out. Father will love Issy. I can guarantee it. If for nothing else than the fact that she was one more mage to help defend the country. He was about to explain this to her, when what she had said penetrated his mind. She had just called the general father. He looked up at her face, slowly. It had drained of all colour, and she had covered one hand over her mouth, eyes wide, as though she was horrified at what she had just said. There were only 2 situations in which a woman not of the family would call a man father. The first was adoption, But Emilia had always resisted that, wanting to keep her own family name, and wishing to keep her family alive as long as she could. The other was when a woman married into the family. "Father?" he asked. A part of his brain, not running through the implications, noted that his voice sounded hoarse all of a sudden. "You called him father?" She took a step back, still looking horrified. "He didn't. No." He shook his head. "He wouldn't, would he?" Adrian knew the answer before he could even ask it. It was painted all over her face. He had. And in a sick sort of way, it made sense. His father did everything for the Empire, every effort to stride forward. Of course, he wouldn't let such a magical talent as Emilia go to waste after the death of her fiancé, his son. Of course, the former High Hand didn't have just one son, did he? "Adrian." Emilia softly put her hand on his shoulder. He looked down at it and felt the anger building like a boiler with its relief valve tied down. He examined his rage like a man would a strange and potentially dangerous animal. He found that it was not directed at Emilia, or even about her. He had no claim on her, nor did he want one. Instead, his anger was directed at his father, a man who had dedicated everything he had ever done to the ideal of Helheim, and damn the consequences. He closed his eyes, feeling his face go impassive as his breathing started to hitch, almost coming in gasps. It wasn't just this moment. It was a lifetime of moments. A lifetime of wrongs committed against him, all condensed down into the last 5 years, not just by his father, even if he was the central figure in his mind at the moment. There was a limit that a man could take, a moment when the world had kicked and kicked and kicked, while he lay wounded on the ground, where a man found that enough was enough. He was done being kicked. 5 years. He had been gone for 5 years, and his father had just realized he was not dead, and he couldn't spend more than 5 minutes with him. Helheim demanded his time more, and like a man with an addiction, he gave into it, as he always did. This was nothing new. Ever since Adrian's mother had died when giving birth to his younger brother, Adrianus had grown rapidly distant. At the time, the younger Adrian hadn't understood why his father had done this. As a man himself now, he knew that it was his father's defense mechanism. He could understand the want to throw yourself into work to distract, but it also showed exactly how selfish his father was. He only considered himself in that instant, not stopping to think about his young son, who was sad, scared, confused, and now bereft of not just his mother, but also his father. He was done with his father being distant, and only sparing him the time of day before going back to work. He was done with this woman, who had neither the spine nor honor to say no to his father, who would foist her on his brother. He was done with his brother, who would accept such treatment from his father. He was done with everything. Everything except Issy. Fine. The world wanted to break him down? Then the world would see what happened when you kicked a man one too many times. Here he stood, torn and ragged, half a man. But that would have to do. "Adrian, He opened his eyes, and looked at Emilia, and something in his own eyes must have registered, for she shut her mouth with an almost audible snap, and he felt the tremor that ran through her body from where her hand rested on his shoulder. "Don't." He growled the sound from low in his stomach, from somewhere deep. She jerked her hand away like it burnt, and clutched it to her chest. He took a few shallow breaths before he growled out. He was shaking now. Every muscle and tendon was as tight as a bowstring pulled tautly. He examined Emilia, and felt both anger and sadness, both at and for her. She could have said no to his father, told him that she didn't think it was right for her to marry her fiancé's brother, but she never would have. He knew this. She owed everything to him, and she could no more have refused him than a river refused to flow. He might have no official control over her or her actions, but the reality of the situation was much different from an intellectual examination of it. Especially after he had raised her and taken care of her when she had just been a small orphan on the streets. It looked like despite Adrian's supposed death, his father had gotten the daughter-in-law that he had wanted. Of course, father would do that. He would do anything for Helheim, wouldn't he? Adrian, his voice had gone flat, emotionless. Had she married any other man, any other, it would have been no problem, no issue. He didn't want her, he had Issy. It was just the damn callousness of the entire situation. That a man could look at the bereaved fiancé of his son, and instead of comforting her for his own son's sake, he would make the best political move possible. I've been gone for 5 years. His voice was rising in volume, and even he caught a bit of the manic edge in it. Presumed dead, and instead of comforting you, he goes and marries you off to my brother because it would be the best thing for Helheim! He started pacing back and forth, the thoughts running through his head, jumbled and clashing. Adrian, A growl of pure anger grew deep in his chest and escaped from between his lips. Something about the look he sent her way had her scurrying back, cringing like she was afraid he was going to hit her, as a few tears streamed silently down her face. Adrian didn't move any closer to her. The way she had backed up checked his movement, even if it did not abate his growing rage. He simply turned on his heels and began running after his father, both fists curled with a fire in his heart, burning all reason away. I'm so sorry, Emma whispered, as she slid down the wall and sat with her knees drawn up. She sat there, her breath hitching as she rocked back and forth, her face buried in her arms. I'm so sorry. Issy spared her a pitying glance, for only a second, before she was off after Adrian. Chapter 5. The sound of rapid footsteps reached Adrianus's hearing much quicker than he would have thought possible. Sighing, he let go of the console chamber's doors he had been about to open to resume the damned meeting. A damned meeting, but an important one nonetheless, with several of his fellow console members, so they could discuss the news of the war that threatened to break out on the Helheim-Kurtz border, and how Swadia's surrender and annexation by Kurtz might affect diplomatic relations. He had just gotten up and left, telling them there was a most urgent matter he had to attend to, and ignoring the protests as he simply strode out of the room, taking Amelia with him. It was an urgent matter. His son, his firstborn, was still alive. Something Adrianus had given up on that hope almost 6 years ago. He knew that this was not going to be the happy reunion that it would be for most families. His family was not like most families. No. Instead, there was a black mark on this reunion, one named Amelia. Adrianus liked the girl. Hell, he had taken her in and trained her himself. She was somewhat of a prodigy in her arts, able to use less reagents to cast more devastating spells, at further range than even Adrianus himself. But she was still a girl, one that had made a series of bad decisions that were about to bite Adrianus in the ass. No doubt Adrian had figured out who his former fiancé's husband was, and had come to his own conclusions, ones that would indeed seem valid. Contrary to what his son currently believed, he had never forced Emma into Janice's bed. In fact, when he had found out that the two of them were cohorting, he had flown into such a rage that it had made rumours at court. The ashes of his son, her fiancé not even a year old, and she was already bedding another man? And even worse, it was his younger brother? He didn't care for the excuses they used, about how it had been natural, two grieving souls lost coming together. Well, Adrianus had grieved, but you didn't see him crawling into his son's fiancé's bed now, did you? Still, it was better that it was he who took this blow. Not that he wanted to protect Emilia or Janus, but he didn't wish for little Adrian to suffer. No, not his grandson. He would take this like a man because he deserved it. He should have had her watched, should have kept a closer eye on her, and this issue would not have been a thing. Turning around, he watched as his son stormed towards him. He knew that look, that feeling Adrian had in the pit of his stomach. He might well hate me now, Adrianus thought, as Adrian pulled up in front of him. He stared at his son, tall and proud, angry and sad. This is going to hurt, he thought. It did. The blow, in fact, hurt a great deal more than he thought it would. His son could throw a rather respectable right hook. The fist connected with the side of his face, and though he had braced himself for it, he stumbled. The vase he stumbled into fell from the table in which it rested, and smashed itself into thousands of glittering glass fragments, scattering the dark wet soil and the flowers that had resided in it across the floor. Adrianus stood there for a second, one hand on the table holding him up, and the other on the side of his aching jaw. He took a deep breath and reminded himself of his son's perspective in all of this. It calmed his anger, and he stood looking at his son standing there, breathing hard, both fists clenching and unclenching. Behind him was that savage girl that was with him, likely a lover, but that was his son's business, not his. Behind her was that blasted woman who had caused what should have been a joyous day to sour like this. His eyes found Emilia's, and he watched as whatever she saw in his eyes registered, and tears started forming, before she turned on her heels and marched away. Adrianus turned back to his still fuming son, seeing Issy, was it? Was standing at his side, her hand wrapped in his, trying, in her way, to calm him down. He was about to address his son when a man spoke out. The nasal voice told him who it was, without looking. "What is the meaning of this?" Sir Guilliman demanded, the dandy fop mopping his brow while hiding behind his chair. "Assassins?" A set of hands reached out, and Adrianus was steadied on his feet. "Settle down, Guilliman. There are no assassins, just some personal family matters that unfortunately crept into the wrong room," Adrianus said, spitting out a wad of blood onto the expensive carpets. Five gods be damned if that last punch wasn't the hardest Adrianus had ever felt. He rolled his jaw around a little, slightly worried it had been dislocated, or he had lost a tooth. "I am the one at fault for this, if you will excuse our intrusion." Reluctantly, the guards in the room removed their hands from the butts of their pistols, or the hilts of their swords. Adrianus gestured to the door and followed his son as he swept out of the room. The door clicked shut with a satisfying latch, and he turned to look at his son. "How could you?" he hissed. "Your problem is not with me," Adrianus said. "I am at fault, but not in the way you think. Explain." Short, clipped, but still a rational response. It would seem that his son, who had always been a bit of a firebrand, was learning to control that anger that burned in him. "I was not aware of the union until Emilia started showing signs of pregnancy, and at that point either I was to quietly accept it, or else cast her out for her temerity." He chose not to mention how soon that pregnancy had started to show. Those were details the three of them would have to work out, and he would have no part in it. "You can see which I chose." "Yes, I can. Once again you chose what was best for the country. You just couldn't let a mage slip away." The fire in Adrian's eyes was not gone. It was simply contained, chained. He closed his eyes, breathing in deeply, and when he opened them, he looked more in control of himself again. "I think it would be best if we postpone the family reunion for a while. Good day, father." And just like that, he turned on his heels and marched out, his savage following along behind him. Adrianus watched the two of them go, and taking a deep breath he turned to the room. opening the door and stepping in. The room was silent as he stepped in, and he looked around wondering how much this drama had politically cost him. "Adrianus, no offense, but you look like total shit," a woman cackled at him, causing Adrianus to look down at himself.
There was blood and spittle all over his dress clothes. He did indeed look a mess, and he was willing to bet the tightness and throbbing on his cheek was caused by a rather nice developing bruise. Yes. And you are still as beautiful as ever, Lady Jessamine." He gave her his best court smile, and turned to look at the rest of the consul. "Perhaps a short recess is to allow me to freshen up? What say you to an hour?"
Adrian took a deep breath and leaned back on the steps of the Arkim, his elbows resting on the cold-worn stone, one leg stretched out down the stairs, and the other bent off to the side in a rather relaxed manner. Issy was sprawled on the steps next to him. No doubt there would be more than a few people who thought such an unladylike way of resting was unbecoming, but Adrian found it rather comforting that she felt she could be whoever she wanted to be around him, ladylike or not. He flexed his aching hand and looked down at it. The knuckles of his first two fingers were split open and bleeding freely, the little rivulets of blood flowing down to drip off of the tips of his finger stubs. He opened and closed his hand, working the muscles and attempting to forget the memories the bloody stumps had brought back to his mind. He sighed and leaned his head back, looking at the grey sky that seemed to perpetually hover over Helheim. "Well, that could have gone better," Adrian said with a sigh. He grabbed the box of reagents and opened them, looking at the small boxes inside. His fingers reached down the motions, remembering from what felt like a lifetime ago. He could name each and every box, and what reagents resided in them, and the stubs of his missing fingers twitched as though they were still there, and they ached to perform their craft. A drip of blood fell off his index, and splattered on top of the leather case holding calamine. He pulled his hand back, and closed the overlid. The corner of her lips twerked up in a small smile, as she shrugged her shoulders. "Ah, Kikano," she said, trying not to laugh out loud. "You don't know?" he scoffed. "Yeah, sure, that went just perfectly, didn't it? Tell me again why you don't speak my language." "Ak Ekano." She smiled at him, repeating herself with both emphasis and that cocky half smile. "Oh, I see how it is. You don't know, huh?" he said with a snort. "Ome." She nodded, her face stern but her eyes smiling. "Woman, you know I think you do it just to annoy me. What do you think of that?" She simply shrugged, a small smile twitching at the corner of her lips. He sighed as he looked up at the sky. "Ishtushka, hitakishish?" she asked, once again scooting in front of him and looking him in the eyes. This time her question, and her eyes were serious. "No, I am not tribeless now, but even if I were, I would still have you, right? A tribe of two." He smiled as he looked at her. She rolled her eyes and pushed back at him, her small hand shoving his shoulder. "What?" he asked. "It's true, isn't it?" "Ishanuka kvad oktva?" she asked, cocking her head to the side and batting her pretty lashes at him. "Oh, now that is cold," he barked out, laughing. "Clearly the other person in my tribe is you," he said. It was good to see that she had still retained her wit and humour, even after 2 years in that hellhole. She smiled and leaned forward, her nose practically touching his. "Holtopa," she breathed against his lips, and he felt the way the corners turned up as she said it, as she pressed in.